In the early decades of the 19th century, the borderlands between Maryland and Delaware existed in a strange half-light between civilization and wilderness. The roads were rough, the farms scattered, and the rivers cut deep into the soil, like veins carrying both life and shadow. The law reached here only faintly, as though exhausted by the journey from the cities. It was in these half-wild lands that travelers sometimes vanished. Families awoke to find children gone, and rumors spread of men who never returned from market. It was here that a woman began to build her empire of fear, a woman whose very name would come to echo like a curse: Patty Cannon. She was not the kind of figure most expected to rule over violence. Women in those days were imagined as silent, obedient and bound to hearth and home. Yet Patty defied every expectation. Hardened by a rough life, born around 1760 into a world that offered women little protection, she grew into someone who learned early that brutality often worked better than kindness. By the time she was middle-aged, she had become the matriarch of a gang that would make the borderlands infamous. Where others trafficked in grain or livestock, she trafficked in flesh. Where others raised families, she tore families apart. The world around her created the perfect stage. Maryland and Delaware still clung to slavery, while Pennsylvania to the north had outlawed it. The result was a dangerous borderland where the free and the enslaved lived side by side, sometimes even within the same household. It was a land of confusion, a land of opportunity for predators. Free black families lived with constant dread, for a free man in Delaware might be stolen in the night and sold as a slave in Georgia before his neighbors even realized he was gone. The Fugitive Slave Act, weakly enforced, meant little protection. The laws were written for the powerful, not the vulnerable. In such a world, the Cannon-Johnson gang thrived. Patty lived with her daughter and son-in-law, Joe Johnson, a man just as ruthless as she. Together they built their operation. Their home looked ordinary from the outside, a farmhouse with barns, outbuildings, and a tavern for passing travelers. Yet behind those doors, fear ruled. The tavern brought strangers, which made the perfect cover. A child could be lured inside with promises of sweet cakes or honey. A laborer could be offered work, a traveler shelter. And once the door closed, the world outside disappeared. The kidnappings followed a pattern. Gang members would watch a village, learning who was vulnerable. They often struck at night, surrounding a cabin, dragging the occupants out while muffling screams. Sometimes they carried iron chains, other times ropes. A wagon would be waiting, and by dawn the captives would be gone. If the victims were strong men, they might be marched south on foot, guarded by armed escorts. If they were women and children, they would be bound and hidden under tarps. In the chaos of the borderlands, few dared ask questions of a wagon that rumbled down the road in darkness. Neighbors whispered of strange sounds drifting from the Cannon farm. Cries that were quickly cut short. The sight of children at a window gone the next day. Yet fear silenced most tongues. To accuse Patty Cannon was to invite her wrath, and she was said to have friends in every tavern and magistrate's office. For years she moved freely, her crimes swallowed by shadows. Those who did survive her grasp spoke of a house that felt more like a dungeon. They described dark rooms where captives were chained, some beaten until they could barely stand. Men were broken with iron rods. Women were starved until they agreed to march south in silence. Children were silenced with threats no child should hear. And when captives became troublesome, when they fought or resisted or cried too loudly, they sometimes simply vanished. Their absence was explained with a shrug. They had been sold, they had run away, they had been taken elsewhere. The truth was far worse. Years later, when the soil was opened, bones were found in shallow graves around the property. The bones of men, the bones of women, the bones of children who had never seen another dawn. The trade itself was ruthless, but profitable. A strong young man could fetch hundreds of dollars on the southern markets. A mother and child could be sold together for more, their bonds of love twisted into currency. In an era when land was cheap but labor was precious, human beings were commodities, and Patty knew the price of everybody she stole. She sold captives down the river, far into Georgia or Alabama, where families would never trace them. Letters could not cross such distances easily, and the law cared little. Once carried south, a free black man became just another slave with no voice, no proof, no past. The cruelty went beyond profit. Stories spread of Patty's temper, of her killing simply to assert control. Some claimed she had murdered more than 20 people with her own hands. A tale told of a crying infant who would not quiet, silenced forever against the stone of a fireplace. Another of a man beaten until his skull cracked open, buried under cover of night. Whether every story was true mattered less than the fear. They inspired, for in the borderlands the line between rumor and reality blurred until they were one. Still, whispers alone could not protect the victims. The gang continued for decades, striking again and again, feeding the insatiable hunger of the Deep South. And all the while, Patty sat at the center, directing, profiting, ensuring the silence of her victims by any means. Her reign was long, but not eternal. By the late 1820s, cracks began to appear. Authorities who had turned blind eyes could no longer ignore the growing number of disappearances. Citizens grew restless, and whispers hardened into accusations. In 1829, a search of her property unearthed horrors too great to ignore. Shallow graves revealed skulls, bones, even the remains of children. The rumors were true. Patty Cannon was arrested, indicted for 4 murders, though the truth was likely far darker. In jail, she reportedly confessed to killing dozens, her words drifting between pride and indifference. Whether she exaggerated or not, the bodies beneath her farm spoke more loudly than she ever could. But justice never reached its full measure. Before her trial could conclude, Patty Cannon was found dead in her cell on May 11, 1829. Some said she swallowed poison to escape the gallows. Others that illness carried her off. Still others whispered that someone silenced her to protect the secrets she might reveal. She was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave, her empire of terror crumbling into the soil with her. Yet death did not end her story. In the decades that followed, pamphlets, novels, and local legends kept her name alive. Some painted her as a demon in human form, others as a cautionary tale of greed and cruelty. Mothers warned children even years later, "Stay inside, or Patty Cannon will come for you." In the dim light of memory, she became more myth than woman, a symbol of how darkness can thrive when silence reigns. Her legend lingers still, a chilling reminder that monsters do not always hide in shadows. Sometimes they live among us, smiling from tavern doors, tending farms, speaking kindly to neighbors, all while building empires of blood behind closed doors. She was not a specter, nor a phantom of imagination. She was flesh and blood. She was greed and cruelty bound into human form. She was Patty Cannon, the woman who hunted humans, the matriarch of fear whose shadow has never fully lifted from the borderlands. Even as Patty Cannon's body lay cold beneath unmarked soil, her presence lingered in every whispered story and every fearful glance cast along the Maryland-Delaware border. The land remembered her. Farmers spoke of bones turned up by plows, of shallow graves disturbed by floods, of lost souls restless beneath the earth. To some, she became a legend of terror, to others a living proof that evil can wear the face of an ordinary neighbor. What made her story so chilling was not just the crimes themselves, but the way she thrived in plain sight, protected by silence, fear, and the fractured laws of her time. The borderlands were always dangerous, but after Patty Cannon's death, people began to ask questions they had once been too afraid to voice. How could a woman commit such crimes for decades without being stopped? How many magistrates, constables, and tavern keepers had looked the other way, taking bribes or favor from her gang? And how many families had lost fathers, mothers, and children who were never seen again? In the end, the number of her victims will never be fully known. Some say dozens. Some whisper it could have been hundreds. For every shallow grave discovered, there may have been others hidden deep in forests, rivers, or swamps. Her trail of blood stretched farther than history can trace. Yet it was not only the dead who bore her mark. Survivors of the gang's raids carried their scars for life. Some managed to escape after being dragged south, stumbling their way back north through forests and byways. They told of children sold to planters who knew nothing of their stolen freedom, of families shattered and scattered so far across the South that they would never be reunited. A free man stolen from Delaware in 1820 might find himself enslaved in Alabama by 1821, stripped not only of liberty, but of identity itself. For him, the border between slavery and freedom was meaningless. Patty Cannon had erased it with a wagon, wheel, and a set of chains. Her death did little to comfort the bereaved. There was no justice for those she had killed, no restoration for the children buried on her land, no reparations for those sold into the Deep South. The state executed no one for her crimes, because Patty herself had cheated the hangman. Her gang slowly faded into the background, but the wounds they inflicted could not be undone. In the years that followed, writers seized upon her story. Pamphlets appeared, some with lurid titles describing her as a she-demon, a bloodthirsty witch, a female tyrant worse than any man. One account even renamed her Lucretia, comparing her to Roman figures of infamy. These tales spread far and wide, embellishing details, inventing scenes, blurring history with horror. Yet the truth needed no exaggeration. The real Patty Cannon was terrifying enough. Communities along the border carried her memory like a scar. Generations later, parents still warned children not to wander at night, invoking her name as a phantom menace. Some swore her ghost walked the roads near her farm, a figure of a heavy-set woman in homespun clothes, carrying chains in her hands. Others said her cries could be heard on stormy nights, the wails of her victims carried on the wind. In truth, what they heard was memory, an echo of trauma too deep to fade. The larger story of Patty Cannon is also the story of America's great contradiction. This was a nation that declared liberty as its founding principle, yet allowed slavery to spread like a disease. The border where Patty operated was not simply a line on a map. It was a fracture in the nation's soul. Free states pressed against slave states, freedom pressed against bondage, and in that fracture, predators found their opportunity. Patty Cannon was not an isolated monster. She was the product of a system that valued human beings as property, that allowed traffickers to profit from misery, that looked away until bones forced the truth into the light. When her farm was torn apart by investigators, they did not just find remains. They found evidence of a shadow world that had operated with impunity. Shackles rusted with blood, caches of chains, places where the ground had been disturbed too often to count. The house that once welcomed travelers now seemed a mausoleum, its walls steeped in secrets. Even the tavern, once filled with laughter and clinking mugs, seemed haunted by echoes of muffled cries from behind locked doors. The property itself became a symbol of hidden evil, the kind that hides behind ordinary facades. Though she was gone, her story spread outward, across newspapers, and eventually into the broader folklore of America. Some cast her as a cautionary tale of female wickedness, others as proof that greed could corrupt anyone, regardless of gender or station. In later centuries, her name appeared in novels, her figure adapted into ghost stories, and her crimes remembered in local histories. Unlike many criminals of her era, she was not forgotten, perhaps because she embodied something that terrified people most: that evil could thrive not in distant cities or wild frontiers, but in the neighbor's house down the road, in the smile of a woman who appeared ordinary until the door closed, behind you. The legacy of her terror forces us to ask how many voices were silenced forever beneath her reign. Each skull pulled from the earth was once a human being with hopes, dreams, and families. Each set of bones told a story cut short by greed. We can only imagine the horror of those final moments. A child realizing the comfort of home had been exchanged for a cellar, a man realizing his freedom had been stripped and sold, a woman realizing that silence was her only chance to survive. Their cries were buried with them, but history carries their echoes still. Patty Cannon's name endures not because she was extraordinary in cunning, but because she was extraordinary in cruelty. She represents the darkest possibilities of human nature when unchecked by conscience or law. Her story is not one of madness, for there was no frenzy in her crimes. They were calculated, deliberate, profitable. She weighed the value of lives in coin, and when they ceased to be profitable, she discarded them into shallow graves. That cold arithmetic is what makes her more terrifying than any tale of supernatural horror. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, the fields and woods where she once ruled seem quiet. Children play without fear. Farmers till their soil. Travelers drive along paved roads where wagons once rumbled. Yet beneath the calm lies the memory of a woman who turned those same lands into a hunting ground. The soil remembers, even when people try to forget. And in that memory, her story remains alive. She died in 1829, but she never truly left. Her name is etched into the history of the borderlands, into the folklore of Maryland and Delaware, into the cautionary tales told by historians and storytellers alike. She will always be remembered as the woman who hunted humans, the matriarch of a gang that thrived on misery, the figure whose shadow stretched far beyond her lifetime. And so, when we speak of Patty Cannon, we do not only tell the story of a criminal. We tell the story of a nation's failure to protect its most vulnerable, of the silence that allows evil to flourish, of the thin line between ordinary life and unimaginable darkness. Her house may be gone, her grave unmarked, but her legacy is carved into the very idea of what it means for humanity to lose its way. Patty Cannon was not a ghost. She was not a myth. She was real. Flesh and blood, cruelty and greed, calculation and violence. She lived among ordinary people, hid behind the mask of everyday life, and used that mask to cover horrors beyond imagining. That is what makes her story endure. That is why her name still chills the air when spoken aloud. She was proof that the greatest monsters do not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they live next door. And so, across the quiet fields of Delaware and Maryland, her story lingers like a stain. Invisible to the eye, but heavy to those who know the history. In the silence of night, when the wind rattles the trees and the earth smells of damp soil, it is said one can almost hear the creak of wagons, the jangle of chains, the muffled cries of captives carried south against their will. They are echoes of the empire Patty Cannon built, echoes that no amount of time can fully erase. She is gone, but her darkness remains, a reminder, a warning, a tale carved into the very bones of the land itself. The tale of Patty Cannon, the woman who hunted humans.